All right, what's up, everybody? So on my last video, I got a comment. It's a question from Julius Caesar, who's a longtime viewer of the channel. How should I go about setting up my back training is what he's asking. So if he has 2 pull days in a week, I'm going to assume he's following a push-pull leg split. Is it best to have one of those pull days as an upper back focused and the other day as a lat focused, doing maybe 3 lifts on each for each muscle group? Or is it best to somehow combine these 2 muscle groups? So this is how I go about programming my back training. The first issue that we all run into as lifters is we fall for the old school bro split mentality of looking at your major muscle groups. So there's your arm day, there's your shoulder day, there's your back day, your leg day, and then whatever else you do on a bro split. When it comes to looking at your major muscle groups, the reason that we identify our back as our back, it stems from this split initially. We look at our back as our back, and there's a problem with this. It's because when you have an arm day, your bicep is not your tricep, and there's no crossover whatsoever. When you have a leg day, your quads are not your hamstrings, and there's no crossover whatsoever. Your calves have nothing to do with your quads. When it comes to a back day, there could be crossover, but at the same time, there could be zero crossover. Your back is a unique muscle because there are some lifts where they do work together, but there are some lifts where they couldn't be further apart. So let's do a little experiment into an actual program. So let's take a couple lifts from my program. So I'm a huge fan of rack pulls and power shrugs. That's a lift for my back. Let's go to an RDL, another pretty good lift for arguably the back, the spinal erectors and the low back. These lifts are entirely different in terms of what area of the back they target. So a power shrug basically only targets the upper traps. An RDL basically only targets the lower back and the spinal erectors, at least in the way that I do them. So you get into certain nuances within your back, because when you look at your chest, we don't call this our front. Like our front delts, biceps, and abs, and hip flexors, that's not our front. They're our biceps, front delts, chest, and abs. When we look at our back, it's not our back. It's our upper traps, mid to low traps, rhomboids, spinal erectors, lower back, lats. Not just our back. But for some reason, we call it back. And like I said, it's from that initial bro split. So to take things a little bit further, this is where you have to start to think. And this will lead into the programming, so don't worry. I still have the programming portion in mind. I do tend to ramble, but I'm not off track, I promise. So when it comes to programming the back, you have to look at each individual lift and what muscles it targets within your back. I would encourage you to stop calling it a back day or a pull day and just identify which muscle groups you're working with. Although if you're following a push-pull leg split, you might be more of a strength-focused guy because it's called a push-pull legs and it's not a body part split, as this might be semantics to a lot of people, but I'd argue not the case, because clearly you're running into an issue where it doesn't specify what muscles are being trained, even though there's different muscles within the back. So basically, you have to look at each movement. I gave you the example of the upper traps compared to the spinal erectors and the lower back with the RDL and the power shrugs, very different lifts. When it comes to something like, let's say, a just outside shoulder width overhand pull-up, what part of your back does that work? That's a pretty good question, right? Because some people would say lats, some people would say upper back since it's overhand. The answer is it's both. It's just a matter of what your technique bias is, what your leverage is bias, and ultimately, what do you feel more? But at the same time, it's one of those little nuances where, yeah, there's probably some type of bias based on your technique, leverages, etc., but there's always going to be some type of overlap. So this gets into the question of how do we actually set the program up and how do we mix different parts of the back together. So assuming you don't want to change your split, if you're going to be following a push-pull legs type split, you have to look at it based on your exercise selection. So how much of the upper back is getting hit on one day versus how much of the lats, same thing for the other day. The way that I would go about programming this, if I had 2 days where I could focus on my back throughout the week, is I would do both portions of the back, the upper back and the lats, on both days. The reason for this is because usually in most cases, opting for 2 times a week versus once a week is the safer option. So if the upper back day was to look like power shrugs, Yates rows, and maybe some other variation of row, depending on how you execute that lift, you might be hitting essentially no lats. Your lats might play a minor role, but past your beginner stage, maybe they won't grow from these rows at all, which is the case for myself. I don't grow lats from rows whatsoever. When it comes to your lat training, let's say you're doing purely close grip, neutral work with a lot of vertical pulling, maybe a little bit of diagonal pulling, and maybe you're doing like a pullover or something like this, or a cable pullover, whatever. You're basically getting no upper back work in. So essentially what this is turning into, if you remove the term back or pull from this day, you're essentially following a bro split because each portion of your back is only getting trained once a week. I'd argue in most cases this isn't the best way to train. I'm a huge fan of 2 times or 3 times a week frequency for each muscle group. So depending on the overlap, you might have to restructure your program. And the reason I do this is, like I said, it's turning into a bro split. So let's say you do only upper back focused work and only lat focused work, and there's no overlap, or at least nothing that would make a significant change in your physique on either day. I would suggest restructuring your split so you don't run into the issue of being too low in frequency and therefore maybe too low in volume, or maybe you detrain quickly, so waiting 7 days to train that same muscle group maybe just isn't the best for you. I would look at your other muscle groups, maybe that are similar to the back in size, in joints used, in overall stimulus fatigue from each lift. How do those muscle groups respond in terms of frequency? So what I would do if I were you, if I was to set up a back day, I would pick a lift that has good crossover. So maybe start off with something like a pull-up or a lat pull-down variation that does train both muscle groups, both parts of your back. After that, I would probably go to something more specific for one or the other. So whatever is your preference, I would probably go to that one next. So maybe you train like a lat biased, say, diagonal pull or a neutral vertical pull of some variation. And then after that, maybe something for the upper back. So depending on how much volume you require for each muscle group to grow, that's going to determine how early on in the session you need to swap over to that other muscle group. So if you can get away with training your lats for, say, 8 total sets per week, for example, after that, you have all the freedom you need to do as much upper back work as you need in that session, depending on what else you have planned. So the way that I do it, pick one lift that biases both, pick another lift that trains one muscle group regardless of any crossover to the other portion of your back, and then pick whatever wasn't trained for last. So something that has crossover to start, and then a lat biased, and then an upper back biased. It all depends on how you respond, so I can't give you an exact answer on this. I would have to know you as a lifter and probably coach you. But what I'd say for that is take some of that into account, restructure as needed. If you guys have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comments. I do plan on every now and then turning some of these questions that I get in the comments into an actual video like this. So if you have any ideas or anything you want answered, let me know. You might be getting a video.